Short Creek right now, hoping to be able to learn more.
We get a lot of messages. Some ask us to look into a case, others send us a tip. Or last week, someone asked, why do we cover so many cases out of the state of Utah? And here's the deal. You have to go back to before hidden true crime existed. When I was a local broadcaster, I reported all over Utah and Idaho. So I sort of know the area, or I should say, I know their secrets. We always say you're as sane or as sick as the secrets you keep. And I can tell you, Utah, particularly Southern Utah, has a lot of secrets. My friend, Dr. Christine Marie, she knows this too. She moved out west from Michigan. And once she landed in Utah, got settled, she gets taken by a religious cult leader, a false prophet. I'm not kidding. So after a time there, she finally gets out, starts to realize what had happened to her, but not in time for her to not be trafficked, abused, mentally tortured. But she's out. After she comes out of the fog, she goes to police. And police tell her, not our issue. We don't deal with fringe religious groups. They say her abuse is her fault. She just joined some crazy fringe group. So it's not their problem that she was assaulted, not their problem she was trafficked or defrauded. Never mind that this was all because of a false prophet, a con man, and what he did to her brain and to her body. Instead, law enforcement blamed the victim, like it's her fault. Because honestly, Utah doesn't like dealing with this type of stuff. Never mind the psychological manipulation, the trafficking, the fraud. She never gets justice. Law enforcement turns the other way because, well, secrets. Secrets that protect very secretive crimes and secret criminals. Secrets that keep people from shining sunlight on abuse, manipulation, coercive control. Sometimes it's easier to turn your back, honestly, on something sinister, like you never saw it, than try to enter into the secrets and make sense of them and bring them out into sunlight. But as far as Christine goes, after she didn't get justice, rather than fly back to the Midwest where she might feel a little bit safer, start fresh, no. Dr. Christine, she decides to move to an even more isolated and more secretive place, the most isolated community in Utah. It's none other than in southern Utah by the Arizona border. It's called Short Creek, a community known for secrets, not transparency. It's known for walls, not bridges, and for isolation, not openness. It's a place where they worship a man named Warren Jeffs, who's serving life in prison for taking multiple underage girls as his wives and abusing them again and again. On a positive note, Christine wasn't moving to Short Creek because she had fallen in love with Warren Jeffs or believed him, or because she wanted to be set up in some plural marriage scheme, or because she wanted to wear a prairie dress and long braid. No, she was going actually to finish her dissertation for her PhD. She was figuring out what had happened to her brain, the scientific reasons behind how she, an intelligent woman who had it all, could have been duped into believing a con man who harmed her in every way. And that's when Christine and I meet. I'm the reporter, assigned to a story in a place that was 40 minutes from where I lived, yet completely foreign to me. And she's this eclectic, freshly minted doctor wearing brightly colored vintage clothing, making her a total standout among the dull colored prairie dresses. She's friendly, yet noticeably guarded. She's hanging up new signs for her nonprofit Voices for Dignity. And I'm trying to get my story. She seems like the keeper of some secrets, but I can't tell. But I'm certainly intrigued. Our relationship develops. My understanding of the community deepens as I cover multiple stories in Short Creek. And mostly, honestly, my understanding deepens because of Christine. She introduces me to her friends, FLDS women, now my friends, and she builds bridges with me in a place that is only beginning to knock down walls. But you also can't just expect to knock down a few walls and assume you knock out an entire system built on beliefs and secrets and isolation. You can't knock down walls and expect 150 years of fundamentalist beliefs and families built on plural marriage to come crashing down to. And that is exactly what leads us into today's story. It is one of the most disturbing cases to come out of a fundamentalist religious group in years. Because after I left the reporting world, by the way, said goodbye to Short Creek, moved, Christine and her husband Tolga, they stayed, and they became even more integrated into life there. According to Christine, the FLDS had been marginalized and dehumanized in the media, making them even more isolated, more afraid of outsiders. And she wanted to change that. She told me, you can't help people by trying to destroy them. We can't just expect them to walk away from their beliefs, their families, and everything they love, yet they still deserve our acceptance and our help. So she stayed with Tolga to help those in the FLDS faith. But years later, we see firsthand Dr. Christine and Tolga, their work in the new Netflix documentary series, Trust Me, The False Prophet. And I knew this documentary was coming. Christine and I still talk. And yes, she is the woman at the center of the series, the one who infiltrated a cult leader's belief system. His name, that cult leader, is Samuel Bateman, and she helped expose his abuse, power, and psychological torture. So despite Dr. Christine never getting justice for what happened to her, she made sure the victims of Samuel Bateman did, that they received justice. But I think what really sits with me when it comes to what happened and what Samuel Bateman did, and it's horrific. I think what gets me is how long something like this was able to go on, even with Christine and Tolga there, helping to expose the man collecting wives and Bentleys. And I also realized there is so much more to this story than the docuseries could even possibly show, which is why we're doing this episode. So don't worry, that's where we're headed. We're going to lay out the entire story. Because how does one man rise to power, convince people that he speaks for God, and end up controlling the lives of entire families while committing crimes that are honestly hard to even wrap your head around? The story of Samuel Bateman, it isn't just about this one singular man who convinced a fringe group of followers that he was a prophet. It's a story about belief, control, a system that long existed before Samuel Bateman even came into the picture. It's about secrets and how they permeate and fester and grow into something so deep, it's impossible to tear down overnight. So before we can fully understand who Samuel Bateman is, what he did, and how he was able to make his own fantastical religious delusions of grandeur an actual horrific reality, we have to go into the origins of the FLDS belief system itself. And it started nearly 200 years ago within a religion that would eventually splinter and create the environment where religions like the FLDS could safely exist and flourish. This all starts with a man named Joseph Smith. He was born in 1805. That's how far back we're going. 1805, rural Vermont, during a time in American history, it's often referred to as the Second Great Awakening. It's this period where religious revival was everywhere. People were searching for meaning. New churches were popping up right and left. Claims of visions, prophecy, divine encounters, these were not uncommon. But what set Joseph Smith apart was the scale of his claims. Because according to Smith, in 1820, he experienced what he called the first vision, where God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him and told him that all existing churches were corrupt and that they did not have the authority to act in God's name, and that Joseph Smith had been chosen to restore God's authority and true church to the earth. So a few years passed by, Joseph Smith now claims that an angel named Moroni appeared to him and led him to a set of buried golden plates. And these plates were said to contain the record of an ancient civilization that had lived in the Americas. Joseph said he translated these plates using divine guidance. That translation became what is now known as the Book of Mormon. And then in 1830, he formally established what would become known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, From the very beginning, this movement was controversial, not just because of Joseph Smith's supernatural claims about angelic visits, but also because of how quickly the religion grew and how tightly controlled the belief system was becoming. Joseph Smith wasn't just a preacher, he was a prophet. And in this structure, a prophet isn't someone just offering their interpretation of things. They are speaking directly to God, for God, to you, from God. The idea of one man holding ultimate spiritual authority is something that's going to be incredibly important as this story unfolds, because it doesn't end with Joseph Smith. It becomes a pattern, because as the church grew, so did tensions with outsiders. Members of the church often lived in tight-knit communities, separated from other communities, because their beliefs and practices made them targets for suspicion, hostility, and sometimes outright violence. They were even driven from multiple states, including Missouri and Illinois. But then in 1844, everything changed, and I mean everything. As a mom of one who is a very picky eater, and honestly also very picky about the taste of his vitamins, I think about nutrition more than I ever expected, because some days you just take the wins when you can get the wins. And that's actually how I learned about something called hidden hunger, where kids are eating but still missing key nutrients their brains and bodies need, right? And that's why I have been using First Day Daily multivitamins. And honestly, I have become a little obsessed with them. They're clean, they're science-backed, and made without artificial ingredients or fake dyes, which really matters to me. And the big thing, my child actually likes them. No battles, no convincing, which if you know, you know. This is big. He likes them. Each serving has 9 essential vitamins plus a blend of organic fruits and veggies, and it's just 2 gummies a day. It's simple, and it gives me peace of mind, especially on those not so perfect food days. For a limited time, our listeners are getting an insane deal. Use code HIDDEN, are you ready for this? And get up to 57% off at firstday.com. Use code HIDDEN at firstday.com for 57% off. Code HIDDEN. In 1844, Joseph Smith was arrested and jailed in Carthage, Illinois, where he was killed by a mob. And this moment created a crisis, a literal historical crisis, because when your entire religion is built around a living prophet, what happens when that prophet dies? There was no clear and accepted line of succession. So different leaders stepped forward, each claiming authority. And this is where the first major splinter happened. The largest group followed a man named Brigham Young, who would lead members west, eventually settling in what is now Utah. But even as the church began to stabilize under new leadership in a safe place in Utah, one practice would become one of the most defining and controversial elements of early Mormonism, and that is polygamy, also referred to as plural marriage. Joseph Smith himself had introduced the concept privately, teaching that certain men were commanded by God to take multiple wives. And after his death, this practice became more openly acknowledged and widely practiced among church leadership. It was eventually framed as a divine commandment and required for the highest level of salvation. So imagine the implications of that. You have a system where a prophet speaks for God, and that prophet can tell members of the church who to marry, how many wives to have, and what is required to reach heaven. It creates a structure where questioning leadership is seen as disobedience to God himself. And as you can probably imagine, this didn't sit well with the United States government, to say the least. By the late 1800s, the federal government began cracking down on polygamy, passing laws that made the practice illegal. There were arrests, property seizures, political pressure, and eventually the church found itself at a breaking point. In 1890, the current church president, Wilford Woodruff, issued what is known as the Manifesto. This officially declared that the church would no longer practice polygamy or plural marriage. And this allowed the church to gain legal recognition and eventually become more integrated into mainstream American society. But not everyone accepted it, because for some members, this was seen as abandoning what they believed was a commandment from God. And this is where the seeds of the FLDS religion began to take root. While the mainstream LDS church moved away from polygamy, there were groups who believed the church had gone astray, that it had been compromised and was no longer the true church God intended. Those groups went underground, holding onto the original teachings. And over time, they would separate completely. They formed their own communities, had their own leadership, and eventually their own prophets. And this right here is how we go from one unified religion to a fractured system of splinter groups where authority can be claimed and power can be taken. They established communities in very remote areas, primarily along the border of Utah and Arizona, aka Short Creek, in places like Colorado City, Arizona, Hilldale, Utah. But these weren't just regular towns. These were very controlled, isolated environments. And in this area, in Short Creek, the church wasn't just part of life, it was life. Leadership had influence over nearly everything. Who you married, where you lived, what you did for work, what information you could access. And so while it's easy for people on the outside looking in to say, well, why didn't people just leave? We have to remember that when you're raised in a system like that, your entire world is built around one belief structure. It's your entire family too. Your identity, your understanding of right and wrong, all tied into that system. Generations of plural marriage, aunts, uncles. Leaving isn't just a simple decision. It means losing literally everything. And while it's easy for people to wonder why Utah authorities didn't just step in, well, when you have an entire origin story based on secrets, specifically religious secrets, where the United States government doesn't even want you to practice your religion in peace. And then finally, the mainstream church gives in and says, okay, fine, we won't openly practice polygamy. But the more staunch traditionalists refuse and instead go into isolation to worship the way they believe God wants them to. It teaches an entire state to look the other way, to say not our issue. It creates a system where the local government looks away when religious fringe groups are involved. It's not just easier, it's literal state history. It's a state founded on keeping secrets. So over time, it's easy to see how this isolation can create dependence on the leadership and the prophet who in the belief system single-handedly speaks for God. And questioning him would be risking your salvation. And as leadership within these fundamentalist groups became more centralized, so did control, until eventually one figure would rise to take that control to an entirely different level. And that figure was Warren Jeffs. Under his leadership, the FLDS church became even more strict, more controlled, and more isolated than ever before. And the systems that eventually enabled someone like Samuel Bateman to rise to power, put a pin in that, those structures were strengthened. They were normalized. During the era of Warren Jeffs, this just became normal life. And that's why understanding the foundation is so vital, because by the time we get to Samuel Bateman, this has been building for decades, for generations. And in environments like that, it doesn't take much for a new leader to step in and claim power, especially if they can convince people that they are the next voice of God. Warren Jeffs wasn't the original leader of the FLDS, but he is by far the most well-known. I'd call him infamous. He inherited leadership after his father, Rulon Jeffs, had been the prophet before him. And when Warren took over in the early 2000s, things changed in a very noticeable way. And just to be clear, the FLDS teachings, they were already strict. I mean, F stands for fundamentalist. Before Warren Jeffs, things were strict. And those who are FLDS, women wore their hair long, prairie dresses and pants under the prairie dresses. But under Warren Jeffs, it became something else entirely. And once someone establishes that level of authority, there are very few limits to what you can justify, which is exactly what we start to see. One of the most disturbing aspects of Warren Jeffs' leadership was how marriage was handled. In the FLDS faith under Warren Jeffs, marriages weren't based on personal choice. They were assigned. Women and girls were told who they would marry, at what age they would marry. And in many cases, these weren't adult women making informed decisions or even being told what to do. These were underage girls who had been raised their entire lives to believe that obedience to the prophet was obedience to God. So when Warren Jeffs told them they were to be married, refusing was not an option. On the other hand, the young men in Short Creek, they were often pushed out, eventually being referred to as the last boys. It was a system where older men were taking multiple wives, including younger girls. And you start to have a serious problem. There are more young men than there are available women. So what happens? Well, those young men become competition. So instead of dealing with that imbalance in any kind of like ethical way, no, they were just simply removed, kicked out, cut off from their families with little to no education or support. Like they didn't even understand the real world. This was happening systematically, and it was justified through religion. Beyond marriage and family control, Warren Jeffs also tightened control over daily life and in other ways. He dictated what people wore, what they listened to, what they read, even how they spoke. Also, no wearing the color red. That was big. The extreme rules were about everything from hairstyle, colors, behavior, clothing, basically anything you can imagine. Outside influences were almost completely cut off, which again increases dependence, because if the only information you're receiving is coming from within the group, and specifically from leadership, then that becomes your reality because you have nothing to compare it to. Your normal is not what another person's normal is. Your normal is not from someone outside in a different community. Normal is what you're used to. And this is where the psychological control can really, really start to take hold. It starts shaping how people think and how they interpret the world and themselves. And Warren Jeffs was very aware of this. But eventually the outside world did start to catch up. Reports began to surface and former members spoke out. Investigations began, and in 2006, Warren Jeffs was placed on the FBI's most wanted list. That's pretty intense. A religious leader of a secluded community on the FBI's most wanted list. Yeah, they're going for the secrets. He was eventually arrested and later convicted on charges of minors. He was sentenced to life in prison.
Mr. Jeffs, would you please stand as the verdict is read?
In the 5th Judicial District, in and for Washington County, State of Utah plaintiff versus Warren Steve Jeffs, defendant. Jury verdict, case number 06-1500526. We, the jury, duly impaneled in the above entitled case, find as follows. Count 1, that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the crime charged in count 1 of the information raped as an accomplice. Count 2, that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the crime charged in count 2 of the information raped as accomplice. Dated this 25th day of September 2007 by the foreperson, Darrell
Finch.
Finch.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffs. You may be seated.
And you might think that once Warren Jeffs was removed, then the system would collapse, right? But that's not what happened, because even from prison, Warren Jeffs continued to have influence over his followers. He was locked away and people were still listening to him, following his directives and believing that he was the prophet. And I think this is one of the clearest examples of how deep this belief system runs. Even without Warren Jeffs' presence, members still had faith and were under the control that had already been established. But when you have a system where absolute authority is normalized and where leadership is tied directly to divine authority, it creates an environment where power can theoretically be transferred or even taken. And that's exactly what we start to see after Warren Jeffs. His imprisonment didn't end the influence of these beliefs. It fractured them. It created instability, yes, but in that instability, new leaders began to emerge, some claiming to carry on Warren Jeffs' authority and others claiming that they were the new chosen prophet. And that's how we get to Samuel Bateman. It's important to understand that Samuel Bateman didn't just appear out of nowhere. He wasn't some outsider stepping in and manipulating people who didn't know any better. He was raised in this system. He was FLDS. He understood it from the inside. He knew the language, the structure, the expectations, and most importantly, he understood exactly how power worked within it. If you can convince people that you speak for God, you don't just gain some followers, you gain obedience. And before he ever claimed to be a prophet, Samuel lived what looked like a relatively normal FLDS life on the surface. He worked as a machinist, got involved in real estate, even tried to position himself as a motivational speaker. Really, actually, is a detail that I take note of because it does show early on he had this desire to influence people and to be seen as someone worth listening to. But there's a moment in his life that a lot of people point to when trying to understand what may have changed in him. So in 1999, when he was about 23 years old, Samuel's involved in a very serious car accident in Montana. He was riding with several other FLDS members, including a man named Moroni Johnson. He was driving. So Moroni was driving. And also in the car, there were two young sisters, Jamie and Victoria Cook. They were 13 and 14 years old. The reason, by the way, that they were all in this car together is honestly disturbing on its own because they were on their way to Canada to deliver the girls to a compound run by Winston Blackmore, who ran the Canadian branch of the FLDS. So these girls had been caught, sneaking out of the house. I would call that a normal teenage thing, but in this environment, that was enough to label them as needing some correction. They were being sent away, essentially trafficked into another sect. So the car lost control on icy roads. It flipped multiple times. Everyone was ejected. They were left in the snow for hours before help arrived, and the injuries were reportedly severe. Victoria was left paralyzed from a spinal cord injury, and Samuel himself suffered a traumatic head injury that left him in a coma. And after the accident and after he came out of that coma, people who knew him did say that Samuel had changed. So before, some people described him as someone you actually enjoyed being around. But afterward, they say he became much more extreme, or rigid might be a good word, more rigid, more intensely devoted to his beliefs. It was almost like something in him had hardened. And while we can't say definitively that this moment caused everything that came later, it's one of those details that I feel I can't leave out. It's significant enough as we look back on the history of things and where it went from there. Because what we do know for certain is that Samuel Bateman remained deeply loyal to Warren Jeffs. Yes, even after Jeffs was exposed, even after Warren Jeffs was arrested. And ultimately, he was loyal to him after he was convicted for minors. And this is one of the most telling parts of Samuel Bateman's story because Samuel, he wasn't unaware of what Warren Jeffs had done, like many others in the FLDS communities. Because honestly, there were a lot of people in the FLDS community that still believed that Warren Jeffs was a prophet, but they didn't know what he had done, or they didn't believe in what he had done. But for Samuel Bateman, he actually attended Jeff's trial. Samuel Bateman heard the testimony. He saw the evidence. He understood exactly why Warren Jeffs was being sent to prison. And yet he still remained loyal. And I think that says a lot about who Samuel Bateman was long before he ever stepped into power himself. So by 2019, the situation within the FLDS had already been destabilized. Warren Jeffs was in prison, still issuing directives, still maintaining some influence over followers. But at one point, this was his breaking point. Shouldn't have done this, Warren Jeffs, as you wanted complete power. But at one point, Warren Jeffs, he declares that sexual relations among FLDS members were essentially forbidden. And oddly enough, guess what? That appears to have been the breaking point for Samuel Bateman. After years of unwavering loyalty to Warren Jeffs, that was the line. That was the line that pushed Samuel to step away from that devotion to Warren Jeffs. But instead of leaving the belief system behind entirely, Samuel did something much more dangerous. He recreated it with himself at the center. Samuel Bateman broke away and formed his own sect, positioning himself as the new prophet. He claimed that he was receiving direct revelations from God, and in order to legitimize that claim, he told followers that Warren Jeffs was either dead or had been translated into an immortal state and was now speaking through him. And in a system where people are already conditioned to believe that God speaks through a single man, that leap isn't as extreme as it might sound from the outside. It's just a continuation with a different voice. And even though his following was relatively small, around 50 people at its peak, that's all it takes in an environment like this. Smaller groups can actually be easier to control, easier to isolate, and easier to manipulate. What's especially disturbing is that Samuel Bateman didn't start by recruiting strangers. He started with his own family. At one point, he told his teenage daughter, who was around 13 or 14 years old, that God had commanded him to marry her and have children with her, his daughter. And just hearing that is chilling because of how casually it was presented. Like it was just another revelation. Well, get this, his wife, Lydia, reacted exactly the way you would hope any parent would react in that situation. She took their children and left immediately. She filed for divorce, went to the police, and she tried to stop him. Well done, Lydia. Unfortunately, though, nothing substantial came from it. And that moment, it's so incredibly frustrating to look back on for me because it could have been this point where everything ended before it really started. Instead, though, it became a moment where honestly, I think Samuel Bateman turned outward and began building something much bigger. With the help of Moroni Johnson, that same guy from Samuel's car accident, and brothers Torrance and Liddell Bisline, Samuel Bateman began recruiting women and girls across multiple states, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and even Nebraska. He told them that he had divine authority, that he was receiving impressions of Heavenly Father's will, and that obedience to him was directly tied to their salvation. And people believed him. Yeah. Obedience to Samuel was their salvation. People believed it. Their group became known as the Samuelites. Parents handed over their daughters, sometimes willingly, sometimes under pressure, but either way, children were being handed over, placed directly into his control. By 2022, Samuel Bateman had taken at least 20 so-called spiritual wives, and at least 10 of them were minors. Some of them were as young as 9 years old. 9. But what he referred to as marriage wasn't a legal ceremony with any official proceedings. Instead, he called it the atonement. And that moment, though, marked the beginning of his sexual relationship with each of his wives, the atonement. Prosecutors, they later said during his trial that his intent was to engage in sexual activity with minor girls and that he did so regularly. And it is so disturbing that not only did this happen, Samuel Bateman created an entire system of abuse around this structure. He forced victims to participate in both individual and group sexual acts involving adults and other children. He arranged for underage girls to be married to other adult male followers. He distributed CSAM and even conducted sex acts remotely when members were separated, ordering them to participate over FaceTime. And within this system, the abuse was ritualized. He referred to these forced encounters as part of, again, religious ceremonies, including that word, the atonement, and an atonement where members are actually required to engage in those sex acts as a form of spiritual repentance. In other words, to say, I'm sorry for my sins. Samuel also required the wives, demanded the wives to wear lingerie instead of their modest underwear that many associate with FLDS. And he even introduced alcohol into the assaults. In November 2020, several women were taken to a hotel in Nebraska where they were forced to witness what Samuel referred to as the binding of brothers. This involved Samuel and Moroni Johnson engaging in sexual activity. And some of those present were reportedly Moroni Johnson's own daughters. So according to accounts, the initial attempt to complete this act failed because Samuel was unable to perform. So the victims were forced to strip and touch him in an attempt to facilitate the act of the binding of brothers. And when this also failed, the victims were accused of lacking faith, which Samuel claimed was the reason for him not being able to perform. The binding of brothers was later carried out at a different time, again, with victims being forced to watch. The victims later testified that this type of abuse occurred on an almost daily basis. Many stated that their parents had either facilitated their involvement or were directly present during the abuse, and in some cases had actively participated or consented to it. That is one of the most difficult things in this case to process. the level of involvement from other adults. This wasn't one man acting alone. Moroni Johnson admitted to allowing Samuel to marry several of his daughters and acknowledged that he knew these marriages would lead to sexual activity. The same applies to Liddell and Torrance. Liddell provided access to his daughters, effectively handing them over, while Torrance became the finance man of the entire operation. He had developed a successful piece of equipment known as the Velociraptor, used in cable installation for wind and solar projects, and he used that money to support Samuel Bateman's lifestyle. This included housing, travel, luxury vehicles. That's where the Bentleys come in. So Samuel, he wasn't just seeking control, he also wanted wealth, he wanted recognition, he wanted power. He even started a YouTube channel where he tried to present himself as some successful and inspirational figure. Well, by 2021, the Samuelites decided to move back to Short Creek. And that's when more people finally started noticing that something was not right. Samuel had left years earlier as a broke, recently divorced man, and now he was returning with money, wives, and a level of confidence that certainly raised eyebrows and a lot of concerns. Reports were made to local law enforcement, but nothing substantial came from those complaints. It was maddening. Authorities later stated that while the allegations were there wasn't ever enough specific evidence of firsthand testimony to take action at the time. Drives me crazy. So in other words, because the victims weren't saying, yes, this happened, not enough action. Never mind that Dr. Christine was getting recordings and taking it to police of Samuel Bateman himself explaining the atonement. They wanted firsthand testimony. That's what they said they needed. Even tips were sent to the FBI that were initially, they went nowhere. And that's another, again, one of the hardest parts of the story to sit with, because there were multiple opportunities where intervention might have been possible earlier. But it wasn't until Samuel Bateman's own desire for attention and recognition started working against him that things began to unravel. Because Samuel Bateman, he wanted to be seen. He wanted to be known. And that's what led him to invite Dr. Christine Marie and her husband, Tolga Caddis, into his world. Christine, again, she'd been working with the FLDS communities for years now, right? She was still running her Voices for Dignity nonprofit. And she had even helped Samuel in the past when he presented himself as struggling after his divorce to Lydia.
Christine Marie is a woman who runs a charity, Voices for Dignity, in Colorado City, Arizona. Voices for Dignity became the place that FLDS members who still believe in Warren Jeffs and still follow his teachings could go for help.
Hey, can I feed the animals?
Esther Beislein is an FLDS member and works with Christine Marie and her Voices for Dignity charity.
I happened to be there when he showed up, and he was asking for some help.
Samuel Bateman was somebody who in 2019 was facing hard times. He didn't have a lot of money and he was going through a divorce.
Kind of felt sorry for him, this poor guy doesn't have any money, his wife left him.
He was somebody who was getting help from Voices for Dignity. And so that's where Christine met Samuel.
Tolga, a talented producer, he was working on a documentary about the FLDS at the time, and Samuel saw it as an opportunity for exposure. At first, their visit seemed relatively ordinary, documenting daily lives, gatherings, and interactions within the group. But over time, the footage began to reveal more structured dynamics. The way Samuel interacted with his wives and followers, and the presence of young girls in situations that raised serious concerns, heightened concerns. Eventually, Christine recorded a conversation where Samuel openly described that atonement practice I mentioned, right? You'd think that'd be enough. Effectively, he's admitting to
One morning, Sam showed up and wanted to talk to Tolga and I.
Christine and her husband, Tolga Caddis, are visiting the group, are spending time with the group.
We got in the Bentley.
Christine is in the back seat with 3 young women. One is a child.
Sam starts telling us a confession.
And he begins to tell them about a religious,
ritualistic.
He felt inspired to direct his followers into.
That he had perpetrated on the females in the car.
Which really is just a sex crime.
Now I know for sure what he really is doing, what I had suspicions of, but no evidence.
A lot of people in town are suspicious. At this point, the local police department is fielding calls from residents.
I grabbed my phone, I started to record, and I just prayed that recording would work.
Sam goes on to talk about all the details of what he had done and directed to be done.
But I had to act as if everything was okay.
Calls the local police. She says,
I think I have the bombshell you need.
That recording, at first, it wasn't enough, but it then did become a turning point. It was handed over to law enforcement. The FBI finally did become involved. Christine began working as an informant and continued to gather evidence while maintaining Samuel's trust. And again, she's realizing that without firsthand knowledge, firsthand testimony of women that are brainwashed, she can't get this investigated. She can't get a arrest, a charge. You know, her own abuse flashing before her eyes, understanding the brainwashing, having a PhD in understanding this. She doesn't have enough, and yet she realizes she needs firsthand experience. So she's gathering evidence, maintaining Samuel's trust, trying to get some of these wives or women or Samuelites to see what's really going on. And even with all of her work, it still took time for the case to fully come together. That is until August 28th, 2022. Finally. And while Dr. Christine continued to build bridges with Samuelites, on August 28th, 2022, a 911 call came in reporting something unusual. The caller reported seeing a truck pulling a trailer near Flagstaff, Arizona, and they also saw what looked like fingers sticking out of the slats. Can you imagine that? Driving behind a trailer and seeing little fingers sticking out from the back of the trailer from the slats. When police pulled the vehicle over, they found 3 young girls inside the enclosed trailer, ages 11, 12, and 14, in extreme heat. This is Arizona, the desert. No ventilation, surrounded by clutter, a makeshift toilet. There's actually footage from this arrest. And as you can see, take a look at this.
The big story this Wednesday night at 10 o'clock, disturbing new details about a so-called polygamous leader who investigators say has more than 20 wives, many of them underage. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jonathan McCall, and tonight from Mark Curtis.
And I'm Cuddy the Divine. Newly obtained body camera video shows his arrest back in August when Flagstaff police say that he was transporting 3 young girls in the back of an unsecured trailer. Team 12's Chase Golightly spent the day going through the body camera footage from that day and is here now with more on what it shows. Chase?
That's right. It was this situation that led to an FBI investigation into Samuel Bateman. Now, we want to warn you, while this video is edited, some may find it disturbing. Body camera video shows the moments authorities pulled over this truck and trailer in Flagstaff. The reason why?
Saw fingers poking out of the trailer.
With guns drawn, they opened the doors.
See the hands!
Finding 3 young girls.
How old are you? 14. 14. How old are you? 11? How old are you?
This alone led to Samuel Bateman's arrest on child endangerment charges. But again, even then, still not assault charges, still not abuse charges. He was released on bail. And instead of stepping back, he panicked. He began calling followers, instructing them to delete messages, destroy evidence, and even discussed getting passports, which raised concerns that he might try to flee. Dr. Christine was still present during some of these interactions and continued to record. And once investigators obtained those recordings, particularly the ones where Samuel was attempting to obstruct the investigation, the FBI moved quickly. On September 13th, 2022, Samuel was arrested again, this time on federal charges, during a coordinated operation that included raids on multiple properties associated with his group. Several underage girls were taken into state custody, but even from jail, Bateman continued trying to maintain control, of course. Using a tablet, he communicated with followers, with Samuelites. He instructed them to perform sex acts remotely and eventually to kidnap the girls from state custody. But really think about that. He wants to maintain control from behind bars and using a tablet. What is he going to communicate? To perform sex acts remotely. That's what's on his mind. That's what he thinks is most important right now. And to kidnap the girls from state custody. And incredibly, they actually did it. Several of his adult followers carried out the plan, taking the girls across state lines before they were eventually located in an Airbnb and returned. At that point, it was clear that this wasn't just a case of abuse. It was a coordinated, multi-state trafficking operation involving multiple individuals. Samuel Bateman was ultimately sentenced to 50 years in federal prison after accepting a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit transportation of a minor for sexual activity, 1 count of conspiracy to commit kidnapping. The judge imposed the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement.
Tonight, after years of abuse and control over several young girls, a federal judge sentenced the man behind it all, the self-proclaimed polygamous prophet Samuel Bateman, to 50 years in prison. Good evening, and thanks so much for joining us. For 12 News at 10, I'm Kadiba Devine.
I'm Mark Curtis. Bateman admitted to those girls who he took as child brides for himself. Some of them spoke out in court today before sentencing in downtown Phoenix.
12 News journalist Chase Golightly was there. And Chase, there was incredibly powerful testimony there today.
Creepy, Mark. 3 former spiritual wives of Bateman, the youngest just 9 years old when she says the began, all face their tormentor and captor, telling Bateman to his face that he no longer has power over them. Samuel Bateman was told he will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. The judge sentencing Bateman, the self-proclaimed prophet of the polygamous FLDS church, to 50 years behind bars for sex crimes against children, telling Bateman he should never have the opportunity to be free and that he is the worst kind of abuser.
His crimes were so heinous and so willful.
Tanya and Matt Browning have been following the Bateman case, learning Bateman rose to power around 2019, claiming he had the blessing of former prophet and convicted Warren Jeffs. Bateman gaining about 50 followers and more than 20 wives, with half of them under 15 years old, with 2 of them just 9 years old. Bateman used his power to force these young girls into having group sex acts with him and his followers, committing these crimes in multiple states. On Monday, inside the Sandra Day O'Connor Federal Courthouse, 3 of those girls faced the man who had so much control over their lives, including a girl who said she was 9 years old when the abuse by Bateman started, stating her innocence was taken from her. Another survivor stating she was just 14 years old when Bateman called on her to be his spiritual wife, with starting just weeks later. They all called his actions pure evil and told the judge Bateman deserves no compassion.
To stand up in a court like that's pretty impactful and incredible.
So I saw what they had to go through to get to this point.
Pam, who didn't want to use her last name, was a juror for a recent trial involving 2 of Bateman's top followers, finding them both guilty. Having heard in detail of the crimes involving Bateman, she wanted to see what his fate would be.
He got what he deserved.
But not everyone sees it that way, believing there's no just punishment in a case like this.
50 years is not enough for 2 9-year-old victims, and that's just a small part. 9 years old, we have to protect our children.
Bateman and several of his co-conspirators, including some of his adult wives, have now been found guilty and will spend decades in a prison cell. But given the history of the FLDS, some believe it's only a matter of time before another opportunist comes forward, claiming to be the prophet.
Sam's gone, Warren's gone. Who's going to pick up the ball now and run with it? And I think it's a message to be sent that if you're going to traffic in little girls, then this is what's going to happen to you. We're not going to put up with it.
Yeah, Chase, it's really hard to imagine how hard it had to be for those young girls to step forward and to address Bateman, who had done so many horrible crimes to them. You really have to commend them, right, for being able to step forward and, hopefully they'll be able to get past this.
Creepy, you're right. It was incredibly powerful to hear them speak and to face their abuser and call for the maximum sentence against them. Because you have to remember, these girls have been through so much. Their own parents, followers of Bateman, gave them, their own mom and dad gave them up to Bateman to be his child brides. The judge said those same parents would actually show up in court to support Bateman and not their own children. But when each one spoke today, they all said they are working on themselves to get help to lead a normal life. One of them mentioned she has foster parents now that actually care for her as a parent should. She's also going to high school, has her own driver's license, and can wear clothes she likes instead of those prairie dresses we see so many women in the religion wearing. They all said the same thing, that Bateman no longer has power over them and never will again. Krive.
Yeah, well, it's good to see that they are moving forward the best way they can. All right, Chase, thank you.
Moroni Johnson entered into a cooperation agreement with federal investigators. So court docs say Johnson supported Samuel by providing financial assistance, allowing Samuel and multiple wives to live in his home. Moroni Johnson later pleaded guilty to one count of transporting a minor for sexual activity. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Well, Liddell and his brother Torrance, they proceeded to trial. They were both convicted on multiple federal charges, including receipt of child sex material, CSAM, 2 counts of transportation of a minor for criminal sexual activity. Liddell received a life sentence, while Torrance was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Now, several of the women in the group were also charged and sentenced for their roles. Whether or not you consider yourself brainwashed doesn't mean that you can break the law and traffic children. Josephine Bisline, originally married to Liddell, later became one of Samuel's wives, and she was convicted of participating in the trafficking of underage girls for sexual purposes and of some of the victims herself. She received a 15-year sentence in 2024. Her attorney, Mark Anderson, painted Samuel Bateman as the master manipulator and said that Josephine was only following his instructions. However, some of the sexual conduct Josephine admitted to happened in Arizona. And while Samuel was traveling to Nebraska, federal prosecutor Ryan Powell said that's not something Bateman forced her to do. He wasn't even with her. And while she did take responsibility for her actions, she reportedly showed very little remorse. Prosecutors also described Josephine as by far the most culpable of any of the women involved. Naomi Bisline, who is a sister of Liddell and Torrance, was also taken as a wife by Samuel and was found to have assisted in the kidnapping scheme and in destroying evidence. She received a sentence of time served after serving approximately 21 months in custody. Other women, including Moroni Johnson, Leah Bisline, and Brenda Barlow, all described as Samuel's spiritual wives, they were sentenced from a range of sentencing from 2 to 3 years for their involvement. Donna Barlow was sentenced to probation for her role in the kidnappings, and another one of Samuel's wives was found to have surrendered her 2 underage daughters to him, knowing that they would be abused. She received a 6-year sentence. Moretta Johnson, the daughter of Moroni Johnson, was 19 years old at the time of sentencing. She had been a minor when her father arranged her marriage to Samuel and later gave birth to a child shortly after turning 18. She was sentenced to time served for her participation in the kidnappings. And then there are the minor victims. After Bateman's arrest, the children were removed from the group and placed into state custody, separated from the environment where the abuse had taken place. Thank goodness. And so over time, as the case has moved through the courts, some of them have spoken out and they have described what Samuel did as evil. There is no other way to put it, but they have said it themselves, the minor victims themselves, what he did was evil. But they also said that they were taking their lives back. That is such an important part of the story here, because as horrific as the details are, so horrific, the fact that these girls survived and that they have spoken out and that they are now trying to rebuild their lives, that needs to be remembered too. They will forever have scars, but I hope for as much healing as possible. And now, bringing it back to this Netflix series, none of this would have been possible without Dr. Christine Marie and Tolga and this move that they chose to make to Short Creek. They didn't just walk away also once this case was built and Samuel Bateman was convicted. No, they're still there in Short Creek, still continuing working with survivors and the wider FLDS community. They're focusing still on healing, on advocacy, and long-term support for the community. Christine has spoken openly about why she kept going. She described being driven by her own past experience that I brought up at the beginning of this episode, and not wanting anyone else to be left without accountability, without consequences, without protection, without justice.
And Christine, how was Samuel Bateman able to avoid authorities for so long? Because people knew about what he was doing.
Yeah, that was the frustrating part. They insisted that they would not charge him unless there was a victim coming forward. And since there was no way to get a victim to come forward unless we spent the time integrated with them so they would trust me to come forward.
No, at one point you said in the doc, you know, I have to, in order to help them, I have to betray them, which I thought was a very powerful thing to say.
Yeah, that was...
Because you had gone to the cops repeatedly.
I had.
Yes.
The minute I learned a new piece of evidence, I would let them know.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fact that they didn't act on it was so frustrating to me, but it's not unique to this town. I mean, I guess a lot of law enforcement agencies want a victim before they will charge.
But you seem to struggle with using the word betray. I was very touched by that because you knew you were doing the right thing, but you were also worried about hurting them.
I was so worried about
Yes.
it. It was such a conflict for me. I mean, it can be the right thing, but I love these people, and I still do. And to know that they are victims of Sam Bateman, survivors now.
Yes.
But that I might be adding to their sense of pain and suffering. I had to go to my own therapist to process that. It was really hard.
She also reflected on what it felt like in those moments of helping the girls leave. And she said that she remembers thinking that they didn't fully understand it yet, but she was walking them toward freedom, even if they didn't know. Years later, her message has always stayed consistent. She points out that these kind of power structures, they're not unique to one group or one place. They can exist anywhere that there is unchecked authority and no one willing to question it, anywhere where there are secrets. And as she's put it, it's about being willing to stand up, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you're judged for it, and choosing to act anyway. One thing Dr. Christine has explained to me is that secrets permeate because of the isolation. And when we dehumanize an entire group of people, the FLDS population, for example, when we put them all into a group of bad, of evil, of deserving essentially to be isolated, that's when secrets permeate and grow larger and larger because of the isolation. If they're not welcome in the outside world, that's where the secrets stay and the abuse continues. She talks so often about the importance of humanizing individuals, even within a group we may or may not agree with, even in a belief system that we may or may not agree with, about humanizing one another. And as she puts it, you can't help someone if you're trying to destroy them. I actually had the opportunity to interview Christine Marie about her own private, horrific story. That conversation was in our most recent episode. And in that interview, Dr. Christine Marie, she tells her very vulnerable story, very personal story, recounting how a prophetic dream led her into a manipulative relationship with a man who claimed to also speak for God. What followed was this, again, gradual pattern of control, coercion, isolation, psychological warfare. And she talks about how her personal story led her to help those in Short Creek and become close to those who are FLDS. Literally, she moved to Short Creek because after what happened to her, she wanted to help anyone else that might struggle with the same thing. She wanted to break the barriers, to pull the secrets out, defending and humanizing those still who are FLDS. Because Dr. Christine points out that she was not alone in helping to expose Sam Bateman. There were many, many FLDS members who saw Samuel for what he was: a manipulator, a liar, a predator. And the FLDS members also helped in the takedown of Samuel Bateman. She wants those who watch the docuseries or learn about the fall of Samuel Bateman to understand this point and see, though, that dehumanization of an entire community or religion isn't the answer. Again, that's how secrets form, how isolation becomes stronger. She explains there are good people, FLDS people fighting to keep their homes safe from someone like Samuel Bateman. I too have learned the goodness that can come from those who are FLDS in Short Creek. And I've even reported on FLDS women becoming certified victims advocates. Thanks, honestly, to Dr. Christine. So if you haven't already listened, I highly recommend listening to my conversation with Dr. Christine and watching the Netflix series, Trust Me, A False Prophet. Dr. Christine's journey is harrowing, out of a cult leader's grasp. But hopefully, stories like this and Christine opening up about her own story, being taken by a false prophet, can inspire more people to have the courage of Christine and Tolga and the victims to step forward and help stop situations like this from happening again. Because remember, all of us, and every place, every person, we are as sane or as sick as the secrets we keep.